Okay. Again, the length, minimum length is around 1.5 type double spaced pages. So you want to hand it in printed form. Unlike what I do with online classes, and I really don't teach any of them here, but I taught them elsewhere. I have them submit the assignment via Blackboard, but this one I'm just having you submit it in printed form, and I will put your grade in Blackboard, but I'm going to enter it manually. If I did it through the assignment tool, then it would automatically go into that, but this is only part of the test. So. Okay. So, I think it's about as wide as we ought to make it. Explain and evaluate the following passage from Plato's Myth of the Cave. The prisoner's reality would consist of nothing but the shadows. Now, remember, you're not writing your essay as a direct email to me, Professor Murawski, from a fellow colleague in philosophy, where we can presuppose among us a lot of already understood background. Remember, when you're writing your essay, and they'll tell you the same in English Comp, you're writing to an imaginary reader who is intelligent enough to understand the stuff you're discussing, the topic of the essay, but who you want to presuppose needs to be brought up to speed, needs to be filled in on background. Not today I played it, but I did. Okay, so we are back to the myth of the cave. Oh, so what I was saying is, you're writing to an imaginary reader who needs to be brought up to speed on some of this. And of course, what's really happening is you're showing me that you've done some of your homework and you understand some of the stuff about which the essay is concerned. So, how is it then that for the prisoner's reality is the shadows? Well, here's where you want to develop some background, right? About the prisoners having been in the cave since early childhood, about the chains that they have around their necks and head, that forces them to look straight ahead at the back wall where the shadows are being cast. So, in other words, the prisoners grow up knowing only the shadows, and for them, then, this is their reality. They're the most real things. Now, as far as the prisoners were concerned, what was wrong with their belief that this was so? Well, for Plato, the shadows represent uncritically accepted beliefs that we've gotten from our environment, or beliefs about reality and what it is. But remember, for Plato, the shadows are at the bottom of the rung as far as existence goes. Remember, for Plato's views on existence are different from the way we've been taught, right? For us, either unicorns exist or they don't. Either Socrates existed as a real person or he didn't. It's Columbus Day. Monday. Either Christopher Columbus existed or he didn't. Right? For us, existence is an all or nothing thing. But for Plato, existence varies in degrees. And the lowest existence level are things that are images of stuff in this world. Because they are, for him, copies of copies. The forms are the most real thing. Individual thing, like the form of a desk, is the most real thing. But that's in the intellectual world. Particular material desks are more real than a shadow or an image or a painting of a desk, but they're less real than the form of deskness. And so images are copies of copies, and for Plato, they're twice removed from reality. So what was wrong with this belief is they think these are the most real things, where for Plato, these are the least real things. Images of things in this world, whether they're shadows or reflections or paintings, which gives you an idea of what he thought of the visual arts in his ideal state. They did not have a very high place in his estimation. At any rate, to go on. So how they came by this belief was what we just said, the fact that they're in there, have been there since childhood, can see only the shadows, and for them, they were the most real. What enabled one of them to alter or question this belief then was taking the philosophical journey out of the cave. That's what that trip of the released prisoner represents. For Plato, a journey toward real knowledge. And Plato portrays this as not being an easy thing. And when you think about it, it's not easy for us to change beliefs that we have grown up with and had inculcated into us by our society. It was not easy for Socrates' fellow Athenians to change the beliefs they grew up with. And so when the released prisoner has the shadows pointed out to him the first time, and he's told, look, what you thought was most real, those shadows, are less real than what I'm now pointing out, the objects that people are carrying that are casting the shadows. And at first he doesn't want to believe it, but then finally, further along in this journey, he gets it. He understands it. So the trip is portrayed as a trip up a very steep ascent out of the cave. So it's not portrayed as an easy walk, and challenging our uncritically accepted, societally inculcated beliefs is not an easy thing. And it wasn't an easy thing for Socrates' fellow Athenians. Now, how are these unusual prisoners supposed to be like us? Well, I gave you a copy of that printout with the 3 columns here, and so basically there are 2 ways depending on which interpretation you're talking about. The one that highlights the critical function of philosophy in getting us to challenge our uncritically accepted belief. Now, the reason, you can see why the textbooks give such importance to this, because that's still relevant today. Whether or not Plato's theory of the forms has any legitimacy, that's irrelevant today. Although it's certainly legitimate today to wonder whether there are established eternal standards for, say, moral principles. But to get back to this, so we're like the prisoners in the... We have grown up in a particular intellectual or cultural environment. We have soaked up the beliefs from our environment uncritically, without criticizing them. And for us, they are the truth. And, just says the shadows are the most real things to the prisoners, so the beliefs that we have inculcated in us are the truth for us. But in terms of Plato's theory of reality, we are, as I like to bring Madonna into this, we are material boys and girls in the material world, right? We're material beings. We don't have a choice in that. The prisoners didn't have a choice in whether they're in the cave. We are material beings, and as material beings, we tend to think what is most real is what our senses put us in touch with, whether it be images of things like the desk or material things themselves in this world. The things our senses put us in touch with. Remember, on the third column, Plato's theory of the forms, everything inside the cave represents things in what we call the sensible world, the world that our senses put us in touch with. And for us, these are the most real things. Now, this is why it's very, and a lot of students get questions wrong, because they still don't get what Plato's trying to... I'm not asking you to buy Plato's view, I'm asking you to try to understand what he's trying to convince you of. And your views are not very different from the views of his fellow Athenians. For them, what was most real was what their senses could put them in touch with. But Plato is trying to convince you that there are eternal standards for things, eternal truths, in another realm, in this case outside the cave, that are more real because they are unchanging and eternal and perfect than any particular thing. In other words, the ideal standard in the realm of the forms for what a desk is eternal for Plato, or the ideal standard for what a triangle is, maybe easier to see with mathematics, is eternal, it's unchanging. For him, it's more real than any particular triangle, or for desks than any particular desk. And so he's trying to convince you that there are unseen things that our reason can put us in touch with, but not our senses, that have a greater reality than the things in the physical world. And of course, that's hard for us to buy. But that's what Plato's trying to sell, whether you buy it or not. So, so again, for him, we're like the prisoners in that we think the world that we're existing in, is ultimate truth, and Plato says no. There's another world that our reason puts us in touch with. So, how does the allegory then give a picture of ultimate reality? Well, I just kind of went over that, and how it does the other view. So that's what's talked about and asked for in the last long sentence, in one. Okay, so to move on, are any questions or comments about one? Well, what does Socrates imagine the laws of the city would say to him when they say he would be destroying them if he accepted his friend's plan of escape? Now, here again, you don't want to write your essay as if you're writing to me, where I know perfectly well the background of this. You're writing to an imaginary reader that you've got to explain why. What is it that the laws of Athens would say, and why would they say it? Right? Well, why would he be destroying them? Well, here, this is why I went into some of the background of what happened at his trial. Right? In order to understand why he would be destroying the laws of Athens and overturning the verdicts of its courts, you have to understand what happened at his trial. And what happened was, okay, even though he thought these were trumped up charges, like that he's corrupting the youth of Athens, turning them into atheists, studying things in the sky and under the earth, being a nature philosopher, making the worst position look like the stronger position because he's a verbal trickster. There weren't penalties on the book for what Socrates was being accused of. So, Athenian law, if there weren't already existing penalties for something that somebody was convicted of, and we saw that in a close vote, the jury convicted Socrates. So then Athenian law provided for what we today would call a penalty phase of the trial. And what they thought was fair was that the prosecutors got to propose a penalty, and then the convicted person or somebody representing them got to propose a counter penalty, and then there would be a second jury vote. And the penalty that the jury chose would be the one the court would levy, right? Well, Socrates' friends wanted to bribe the jailers and get him out of there and let him go into exile in Thessaly, a Greek city. Now, had Socrates proposed going into exile during the penalty phase of his trial, and the jury then voted for that rather than the death penalty, then Socrates could have gone into exile with the blessing of the state. He would be going in there in sync with its laws, and the verdict of its court would have been that he'd go into exile if he proposed that. But we saw he doesn't propose a real penalty. He says, look, what I'm doing in challenging you fellow Athenians to examine your beliefs about things like justice, moral virtue, what's important in life, is it just wealth and fame, or is it being a good person, and other things. He says, I'm performing a service that's so valuable that I shouldn't need to worry about where my next meal is coming from. So Socrates says, look, I don't think I deserve any penalty. I'm not even going to assess a small fine as my penalty, or suggest that. You want a penalty? Here's a penalty. A state pension, free meals for life in the Prytaneum, the expensive state dining hall where the political bigwigs in Athens dined, and where they honored the Olympic athletes who had brought Athens glory in the past with a state pension. Is that a penalty? No. Right, so the jury has only one real penalty on the table, and so the second vote is not close. They vote for the only penalty they have. So now you don't have to go into every single detail that I just gave. I gave that detail in part so also, there's some questions that deal with the stuff in the Crito. But that background lets you know that now, having been convicted and having been given the death penalty, now should he instead accept his friend's offer of escape and go into exile, he would be overturning the verdict of the court. He would be a lawbreaker as well. And so he would, in effect, be destroying the laws of Athens because, as the laws say, how can a city exist if at will private citizens think that they can overturn the laws and the verdicts of its courts at will? And I gave you the trivial example of what would happen if all of you who drive, I'm sure some of you do, if all of those of us who drive said, you know what, I'm tired of stopping for red lights. I'm just not going to stop for any red lights anymore. Well, it would be chaos, right? If private individuals wanted to overthrow, just laws at will. And so the point is, now Socrates would be harming the state if he left. And so it's why the laws would offer the response that, what are you trying to destroy us? Because he would be. And so Socrates thinks in doing so, he would be going afoul of a moral duty we have not to harm someone who's innocent, who has done no harm to us. But also, so I asked you whether you think he should had a moral obligation to stay. And Socrates has this unusual argument that the state is like a parent to him. It was under the laws of the state that his parents got married. He was educated, just like those of you who went to Baltimore City public schools were educated by the city of Baltimore, right? He was educated in Athens. And Socrates views the state as being like a parent to him. And he says, not only don't we have the right to harm somebody who's innocent, but he says, even if the state harms us by punishing us unjustly, by wrongly convicting us of a crime, we are not on the same level as the state to strike back at it. So he says, I'm not on the same level as the state to overturn the verdict of its courts. And so he says, I need to say it. And this is odd, because many of us would not quite accept that. So, in other words, we would... Socrates did say that we can try to persuade the state that they're wrong, as he tried to do at his trial. But he doesn't think we have the right to outright strike out against the state, even if we're punished unjustly. So I asked you to weigh in on that in the last sentence or two here for or against. So those are some of the things I'm looking for. I'm going to spend most of my time on the first three here and not as much time on some of the others because we've discussed some more recently, the stuff's on Aristotle. I always start review sessions at the beginning, as far back as the test is going to go, and then, whatever I don't finish is going to be more recent stuff. Why was it important to Dr. Martin Luther King that we be able to make a clear distinction between a just and an unjust law? And again, here is a case where you want to give a little background. To whom was the letter written? Fellow Christian clergymen. At least that's who the letter was addressed to originally, who were uneasy about Dr. King's breaking laws, like the segregationist laws that he's now challenging in Birmingham, Alabama. Why are they uneasy about it? Because there's some clear New Testament passages that Christians would take seriously, if they take their own Bible seriously, that seem to indicate that it's the duty of a Christian to obey the laws and of the state that they're in, because no government could exist at all if God, who is all-powerful, did not allow it to exist. So he's saying, how is this consistent with your Christian faith to break the laws of this society? And this is why it's important for him to make this distinction, because he cites the theologian and philosopher St. Augustine, who lived in the 400s AD, saying that an unjust law is no law at all. So Dr. King says, hey, I agree with you that we as Christians have an obligation, a moral obligation, to obey just laws. I accept that part of the Bible, but he says an unjust law is no law at all, and we have a duty to even challenge and disobey unjust laws. So that's why it's important for him to be able to make this distinction. If he says we can obey some laws and disobey others, then he's got to be able to defend this distinction between just and unjust laws. And we saw that he says a number of things there. He believes that just laws are in sync or in harmony with the moral law and the law of God. But he also thinks that just laws uplift human personalities and unjust laws degrade human personality. And he gives his own take on segregationist laws, that he says they distort the personalities of the people who make those laws, as well as the people who are forced to live under them. Why? Because they give those who make them a false sense of superiority, and those who have to live under them a false sense of inferiority. So they distort the human personalities on both sides. And he says this is another characteristic of an unjust law. And there are some other things that he says, about unjust laws treating other human beings as if they're not human beings. And so you can bring in what I ask you to do in number 3 is to look at what he says there and try to make his case for why segregationist laws are unjust and can be disobeyed. As best he can, make his case that segregationist laws are morally unjust, as he makes it in the Birmingham jail letter. Again, to remind you that even if you don't have your textbook, I put a copy of the letter from a Birmingham jail in supplementary readings in Blackboard. So, 4 is kind of a challenging one, but Dr. Martin Luther King said much of what he's doing in going down there in Birmingham is the same thing Socrates tried to do. He even, we saw, bring Socrates into the discussion. And he says, just like Socrates confronted his fellow Athenians about their beliefs, especially the ones that he thought were problematic, and raised a tension. So he says, remember, Socrates says he's like a horsefly. Sometimes people need stinging, need to be awakened and challenged on what they believe. And so Dr. King, in going down there, was trying to create a creative tension to bring things to a head so that people who didn't want to negotiate on these segregationist laws would be ultimately brought to the table. That was the goal, was non-violent methods. But I also say, are there differences between Dr. King and Socrates? And what we said about Socrates, I mean, Socrates seems to think that we just don't have the right to be disobeying laws, even if they're unjust laws and even if we're unjustly punished. I think Dr. King makes a more straightforward case for disobedience to unjust laws than Socrates does, in making that distinction. So there's some of the things in 4 that you would want to bring in. Now, in the other one, in 5, remember I said your authors at the end of that Aristotle selection in your textbook summarize about 10 of Aristotle's virtues. But what I list here are some of the ones that are most often talked about. They're also some of the ones that I have in the PowerPoint on that. And remember, you also have integrity recordings of these PowerPoints that I've copied in there. So I ask you to choose 2 from this list, or if you want to bring in something from the other list that's summarized in your textbook, that's fine. And to show how Aristotle would portray the virtue. So remember, a virtue again is that's the mean, that's the middle. What's at the end are 2 vices: a vice of deprivation, a vice of excess. All right, but the virtuous course is the mean. So I ask you how he portrays them this way, and what you think of that. I mean, not everybody is on board with this. I mean, take sexual ethics. That falls under temperance. The needs of our body for food, drink, and sexual fulfillment are talked about by Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And for Aristotle, total abstinence would not be a virtue. It would be a vice of deprivation. Whereas in, say, the Judeo-Christian tradition, even if somebody would celibate all of their lives, that would be looked upon as a virtuous choice. So there are differences. Take sacrificial giving. For Aristotle, that's looked upon as a vice. In the Judeo-Christian perspective, there are times when sacrificial giving can be a virtue. And, so Aristotle gives us a model, but it's not a model that is consistent with everybody's belief about what a virtue is. So that's kind of what I'm looking for there. Now, do you agree with Aristotle that virtue is its own reward? Why be moral? Well, we were talking about Socrates, or at least I would, in the Crito, and why was it important for him to get it right? To make the morally right choice? Well, Socrates and Plato actually believed not only in reincarnation, but they had a kind of law of karma going without ever talking about something like that. In other words, they thought that how we lived our lives here and now would actually affect what happened in the afterlife. So Socrates wanted to get it right as to whether or not to choose his friend's escape plan, because he thought his choice would affect what was going to go on for him in the afterlife. And he didn't want to do the morally wrong choice, or make the morally wrong choice. Whereas for Aristotle, we don't think he believed in an afterlife. For him, if ethics has any payoff, it's not in an afterlife, but it's in the here and now. And it's in a life of eudaimonia, a well-balanced, happier life here and now. That's what Aristotle's after. Not everybody agrees that the best life to live is the virtuous life, or that the virtuous life is going to be the happiest life, or that virtue is its own reward. But in any rate, I ask you to weigh in on that. But again, by the time you weigh in on these things with your own view, you've also given some background. Because remember, you're writing to this imaginary reader because you're trying to demonstrate to me, your professor, that you understand something about, what we've been studying the last month. So, and that you can express it in written form. Okay, so the essays due Monday. We do the in-class portion Monday. That's all we'll do Monday. So some people take 20 to 25 minutes. Other people will need the whole period. You'll have the whole period. You'll be free to leave when you finish. And you don't need a Scantron again, because I'm going to just grade these on the test paper the old-fashioned way. Let's see. Yeah, so you want to turn your essay in on time. I will try, if you send me a draft, I'm going to try to review it and send you back one with comments, and preferably in Word. Again, the sooner you get that to me, the better. Don't necessarily think you're going to get a reply if you send something to me at 9 o'clock Sunday night. You can try, but you want to try to send your draft out earlier than that. Okay, thank you very much. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you on Monday.